and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're here with Eli Sennesh, and we are talking about some of the structural and informational ideas around AI and cognition in Nicholas Villarreal's Soul of a New Type, which people should watch the show on probably before watching this one. Because we're gonna be Eli will often be responding specifically to that show. So hi Eli, I wanted to ask you, since you actually study a lot of this stuff, what are your qualifications in information theory and sociology?
Let's see, sociology, I would not say I have formal qualifications, and I would hope I haven't claimed to do so. My apologies if anyone was deceived by some means. Regarding
that may have been my misunderstanding. So,
right. So regarding both information theory and psychology and neuroscience, I basically did a PhD where I worked in two labs at the same time. One was a probabilistic machine learning lab, so information theory was part of the coursework there, and the other was a cognitive neuroscience and affective psychology lab. So that's really where my training in those two subjects comes from. Then I did my postdoc in systems neuroscience.
Okay. And my background is nowhere near as qualified. I am married to a bioinformaticist PhD candidate, or student. I don't think she's actually at the candidacy yet. I know educational psychology, the elephant's graveyard of psychology, except for left theory, which is the even elephant's graveyard of the elephant's graveyard of psychology, since everything's stuck in late 1920s Freud. Okay, so I wanted your general response, because I consider myself influenced by functional structuralism, but I'm pretty skeptical of classical structuralism, because whenever someone tells me the unconscious is structured like a language and I go, oh yeah, prove it, I don't think I've ever gotten a proof. So
okay, so I think it would probably be a good idea to define what you mean by classical versus functional structuralism.
Functional structuralism to me would be like,
not my field.
Okay. Functional structuralism would be like, we talk about the structures in an almost empirical way. Like, these are the relations. This is how they model. This is how the networks model. And it does bear it has a historical legacy to structuralism. Structuralism as a science doesn't even come from sociology. It comes from linguistics. But there's a bunch of early 20th century structuralists, Althusser, Lacan, and a bunch of people in France who argue that the mind is basically structured like a language, and that's how we have to understand that. And I have said, like, okay, that made sense to me as a 19th century understanding of the way language works, the way like Boolean theory is a 19th century understanding of cognition. But from my understanding in educational psychology and cognitivism, those kind of assumptions have not borne out when trying to map the structures of the mind. There are structures of the mind, they're real. So there is something that semiotics is getting to. But the assumption that it mirrors language or semiotics in language is a bad or false assumption. That's my general understanding, and that goes into educational my understanding from educational psychology. But you've worked in neurology and various other forms of psychology. So what's your understanding there?
So my understanding would really be that language is sort of this thing that we evolved relatively late. And that's not because there was, no precedent for it in evolution. That's because we needed to develop fairly advanced theory of mind before we could acquire sophisticated language. So if you have, an organism that's earlier in the lineage, then effectively you still have, social signaling to conspecifics. And I don't mean this in the economist's way of signaling. I literally mean, dogs can, well, not dogs, we bred dogs, but, wolves and coyotes, for instance, can use gestures and sounds, as can apes, to convey information to other animals. But in order for that to get elaborated enough that you can make language out of it, firstly, you need more theory of mind. And as what might have evolved as part of theory of mind, you do need, that famous R word, recursion, so that then you can build up the individual signals into grammatical structures that, recurse as Chomsky described.
Now you have probably listened to me critique Chomskyan linguistics, and I was going to ask you how much in the Great Language Wars, because I tend to think Tomasello's critique of Chomsky is actually pretty hard to refute. That not that Chomsky is necessarily wrong, but that Chomsky's explanation could also be explained perfectly well by external mechanisms or coherences with forms of which the mind sees, which means that you might not have anything like universal grammar. And Chomsky himself has reduced like the amount of universal grammar he thinks would exist over the, between the 1950s and when he retired. But how much do you think that theory still holds in like cognitive psychology?
In cognitive psychology, I'd say it's basically a flame war starter at this point. Like it's really the kind of thing. So I am thinking of a conference I was at in 2022. There was a workshop after the conference, and of course there's, a party, and, tongues get loosened enough for people to start saying what they really think about things. And, we basically ended up in sort of this fight where my side is saying, well, I think, sensory motor processing can pretty much explain most of the major forms of cognition, and that therefore bottom line for it, well, what you could call bottom line for like these more sociological views, that humans are very, very continuous with animals, and our cognition is very, very continuous with our slightly earlier ancestors in the lineage. Gradual change, no disjunctive break. And this other guy, I'm going to call him John, that's his first name. I will not reveal his last name because, of course, I remember this, but he didn't say, oh, you can go and, tell people this scientific gossip with my name on it. Fair anyway, enough. He's quite senior, very tenured, et cetera, et cetera. And he basically insisted, no, I don't think that poetry, literature, classical music, I don't think any of that can be explained as continuous with sensory motor processing. I think you really did need to develop this additional sort of neurocomputational building block of grammar and recursion in the very late evolving frontal areas of cortex. Which is to say that it's hard to actually give definitive evidence one way or the other, partly because it's hard to make cross-species comparisons, partly because it's hard to do, invasive recordings in humans that would allow us to test the hypotheses, and partly because when you get down to the detailed theoretical level nowadays, that is the level of really trying to, formally model what is going on inside, the brain, then, the different theories or the different camps can become a little more mixed in with one another, and you need more nuanced category divisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think about I've been thinking a lot about this in regards to like Ian hacking and types of people, believe it or not so much in language, but that a lot of the debates we have around like whether or not there was autism at the rates that we have now 100 years ago is actually as much an epistemic problem as it is a scientific one, because do we look for a category before the category existed, and if the category itself has a fluid, definition over time, which autism actually does, is that because we are understanding like autism in the universe as a condition that exists outside of the set of conditions that we have called it, or are we actually changing our definition of what we're looking for, and this would have been just labeled other things in the past? And to me, the second answer is transparently obvious, but I realize that a lot of people are secret Platonists and don't realize they're secret Platonists. Like when they tell me like language means things, and I'm like, language means what we agree that it means. Like, so these categories, like
that's why you need the theory of mind in order to get language, that you need to have at least enough of an understanding of what's going on in the other person's head to think, how do I make a noise that will convey what I intend it to convey, rather than conveying something completely different and throwing them off.
So I have gone from a skeptic in the LLM wars to a skeptic and counter skeptic simultaneously. So I am skeptical of the business claims of LLMs. I am skeptical of the economic utility of some of the LLMs for reasons of hidden cost, NVIDIA chips, this, that, and the other. But the actual scientific utility, of which I used to think there was very little, I have changed somewhat. So has Nico. So has Nico. Actually, that's part of why he wrote that book. And I wanted to get your experience with this because I admit that while I do think a lot of what LLMs produce is slop, I also know that I can personally train them to do very complex tasks pretty well with sufficient feedback. Now, I guess the question that I have for you is, how is that like people?
Okay, at some point I'm just going to have to compose like a formal talk on this or something, because people are going to keep asking. I would say that LLMs are sort of a lot like if you tore the hippocampus out of your head and just ran it alone.
Okay.
So
can you
for those,
explain what that means for laymen? But I have an idea.
Yeah. So, for laymen, first of all, hippocampus is the Latin word for seahorse. It's this sort of seahorse-shaped structure in your brain that is involved in sort of taking your short-term episodic memories that your brain accumulates over the course of a day, and slowly, often during sleep actually, transforming them into your long-term semantic memories. So a semantic memory might be, you know what a computer is, you know what a tree is. You don't have to remember a specific time you saw a tree in order to know what a tree is. Instead, you remember something more like this fuzzy collection of every time you ever saw a tree. Mm-hmm. Now, what this comes down to is that the hippocampus is very, very good, or really, its specialized job is to take sequences of inputs from the rest of the neocortex, you could say. Now, I can hear my advisor yelling at me, neocortex is the wrong term, it's isocortex, whatever, fine. Point being, it takes these inputs from the rest of the neocortex, especially through entorhinal cortex, which has what are called grid cells. Okay, so what are grid cells? Why do I bring this up? A grid cell, if you sort of plot the firing of grid cells over a physical space, like a table or a maze that a rat's running in, or just an open field that an animal is moving in. Whenever the animal moves, say, essentially whenever it hits sort of the center of a sort of little square you could draw on the field that is on the space of movement, the grid cell fires. Actually, whenever it hits the corner of a hexagon, you could draw on the space, the grid cell fires. So what this helps to tell us is that there's some machinery in your head that is taking sort of the raw sensory motor stuff of your experience and turning it into, a neat, we call it a cognitive map, like a map of physical space that is in your head. And then the sequence of locations that you move through on that map becomes part of the input and output of the hippocampus. So in the hippocampus, we'll find these nice things called place cells. They fire when the animal is moving through a specific place, a specific landmark. Now, of course, that's the classical finding going back to the 1940s. That's from Tolman, I think. So these are very old, well-established, well-replicated findings. Nowadays, there's, of course, a lot of subtlety and arguments about, are place cells just one kind of sort of, you could call it semiotic location cell? Like, are there, essentially, there's all these other kinds of cells that will fire for other things in the hippocampus as well. So are they all doing the same job in a more abstract representation, or are they all doing slightly different jobs in a concrete representation of what the scientist can see? This is all, subtleties and debates, but one thing we can get right to is that a hippocampus helps to memorize sequences of events. So when you memorize a poem or a song, you're using the hippocampus. When you memorize the route to work or to your friend's house, you're also using the hippocampus. Remove the hippocampus and your ability to memorize new sequences goes away, even while you retain more or less the entire rest of your cognitive faculties. So the point about LLMs being, what do? They memorize sequences. They memorize all the sequences of text tokens in their training set. And then they can reproduce them when prompted autoregressively. So to start criticizing a little bit, because I have to say, I personally don't use LLMs because I think they're an overly fancy party trick, like I don't always trust having this thing looking over my shoulder while I work, like all kinds of reasons. But, broadly, based on how they are trained, which is, memorize the input corpus and interpolate on it, do I think they can think? No. Do I think that they can memorize and generalize among what they've memorized? Yes. Does that do something interesting that, for instance, Markov chains 20 years ago for generating spam emails couldn't do? Absolutely.
But it is actually still on the spectrum of Markov chain. Yes and no.
Yeah, but it's autoregressive. So the mathematical definition of a Markov assumption doesn't hold.
Okay, got it.
Like a Markov assumption would be you sum up the entire state of the world in one token of fixed dimensionality.
So I guess one of the questions that this leads me to is, what does it mean when people keep on asking? 'Cause I have also basically said I think LLMs don't think, that they are memory processes that you can train on an instance. I've heard a lot of people say they don't learn. That to me is a more complicated question, because I'm like, well, what do you mean by learning? Do you mean the ideomotor effect? In which case, kinda. Do you mean the sustained feedback, sensitivity, and memory. And I'm like, well, they won't learn from instance to instance, but they'll learn in the instance. I mean, like, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Like is it learning if you only learn when the training software is running?
Right. And I will also say some humans do that, but it's on certain things. But
I'm actually, you know what, I'm going to object on behalf of humans and just sort of say learning is metabolically expensive. The brain spends 20% of the calories you burn every day. And so creating an environment in which the system meaning your body and brain, can make the metabolic investment of actually learning rather than disregarding novelty. Like that's something you have to produce the conditions for. If you bring in a child who's, hungry, thirsty, and halfway traumatized by being around adults all the time, they're not going to learn shit.
No, absolutely not. Because we refer to this as cognitive and emotional load in educational world, but basically it means like you don't have the processing capacity to handle the situation you would in a more ideal situation. And that was why we did things like feed kids in the morning back when we had those sorts of programs.
We called it allostatic load in our literature.
Remember, as I like to explain people, when something moves from real psychology to educational psychology, it often gets stated in more basic ways. I was about to say dumber ways, but sometimes you actually do need to state it in more basic ways.
Also, allostatic is a little bit of a... Allostatic is one of those words where like 10 people know what it really means and properly understand it, and those people are trained physiologists. And everyone else using the word is kind of bullshitting. Like there are people who won't read a paper with the word allostasis in the title. And despite my having written one of those papers, I kind of get it, why you wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, it's like me when I mention feedback loops, and I always forget because I fall into common language and I refer to negative feedback loops. But I'm like, no, actually, a bad feedback loop is a positive feedback. Never mind, guys. It's just...
Well, like bad and positive feedback loops can either... I remember like the mental sensation of actually getting what positive feedback does, because I feel like the pop impression of positive feedback is that you just draw an exponential growth curve and line goes up.
Right.
Therefore, the feedback is bad. But actually what will happen is that, the line going up will hit an upper limit and just flatten out. So positive feedback can do one of two things. It can either switch a system between two more or less discrete states, like two, we'd call them attracting states. And if you put it in the middle, it'll tend to gravitate to one or the other depending on what's closer. Positive feedback can do that. It can also cause oscillations, where a system bounces back and forth cyclically.
Yeah. In the literature I've read in social ecology, they tend to focus on the oscillating feedback loop. The other is mentioned, but it's not sexy, so it doesn't get the literature in that field.
Actually, to make this very relevant to the Varn vlog viewership, like one of the problems we might have in Marxism and in socialist sort of scientific socialism generally is distinguishing the state switching or the phase transitions from the oscillations. We've been predicting the collapse of capitalism and a phase transition to something else for a long, long time. And unfortunately, it often seems to oscillate at something like a scale of, 50 to 70 years, depending on the thing you're measuring.
So, it actually does kind of like a Kondravev ray plus whatever Schumpeter was talking about. Creative destruction, blah, 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 blah.
Like, it's been about a decade since I'd have to go hunt down the book I read that had, Kondratiev waves in it. But like, yeah, like it can be unfortunate when we, see something that looks like positive feedback and go, this system is about to destroy itself and phase transition into something else entirely. And then it reaches the top and turns back down.
Well, I would say that, one of the things I like about Nico's work is that it actually does engage with information theory and whatnot, which most Marxists today, not including me in practice, but including me in training, are humanist. We don't really, I don't think Elaine Sokol needs to write a book about us bad because we're just using all the metaphors from science wrong. But I do think sometimes I even go, man, some of these Marxists really do that shit where we have a theory for everything, so we don't have to actually fucking know anything, and like we just talk about whatever. And for me, the big one is like the assumption that the forms of capitalism that we're given are always about the crash. And that's actually why I started getting into looking at other forms of society, because I'm like, okay, well, how long did it take feudalism to go down? What was, was it even a mode of production? And my argument is not really, kinda. And
I mean, as long as we're admitting to these things, like, I am not a true believer in the Neofeudalism thesis, but I would say there are tendencies towards modes of extraction versus modes of accumulation that you can sort of see, overlapping and trading off against one another.
Yeah, I'm
sympathetic to saying, we've entered for the moment, we're in a heavily rentierized, like structuralized moment in capitalism that, like, if you think that there's literally someone sitting there collecting rents, empirically you're not wrong, but do we understand this well enough to predict that we've phase changed into a whole different system entirely? Yikes, I really don't think we understand it that well.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would even go so far to say if we did, we might actually have to argue that prior epochs of capitalism weren't capitalism. Which, I mean, I've said this the other day. I mean, that could indicate that your theoretical framework is now incoherent and you have to rethink it. And I don't want,
it could, but like the problem is you need to accumulate a lot of converging evidence in order to actually, motivate a paradigm shift. Like, you can't point and say there's a lot of inconsistencies, therefore we should paradigm shift.
No, well, you pretty much can only paradigm shift well after the fact on this one. Like, you'd have to, like, it would have had to been obvious that like this rentier mode functions fundamentally differently, that markets don't exist anymore, blah blah blah. And the labor market very much still exists, and stuff like that. To get it back to this AI though, and the soul of the new type,
yes, definitely.
Although it's interesting because I do think we have to, like, one of the things I liked about Nico's initial engagement with talking about LLMs and AI is like their, for lack of a better term, teleological orientation towards market capture is a problem. Because one of the things that I've said about them is they're marketed for things they're not good at. And because the things they're good at would increase labor productivity and efficiency, maybe, if you could get the power cost down, right? At least for certain anything that's heavily throughput and you don't need a lot of quality control, or you don't care if there's a lot of quality control. See modern translation software.
Okay, yeah, fair.
You can use it for, but it. I have to check it like crazy. Like I use it now because, you know, I'm actually kind of being mandated to do by school boards and stuff. And I have to check it constantly. And students do not know how to use it in an effective way. And teachers don't know how to teach them to use it in an effective way. And despite the fact that, like, there's entire companies that have come to be to try to offer LLM-based products to education, they can't teach people how to use it in an effective way either.
So I think part of the problem is that when you're talking to a person, a real person, you know, both of you are adjusting the language you use to each other and to the circumstance in which you are speaking to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas LLMs are sort of, there's this popular meme, you know, showing an LLM as like a gigantic HP Love, you know, many-faced HP Lovecraft monster wearing a little smiley face mask.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's actually not quite that. It's more like they're the statistical average of every author in the training corpus weighted by how much text they contributed to the training corpus. So LLMs are sort of really good at giving, you know, acting like sort of the ghost of the imagined average normie, but no one in specific.
Right. Well, I mean, it reads like ad copy a lot of the time for that reason.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
again, you know, weighted by how much they contributed to the training corpus. You know, now consider how much of the text in the training corpus is effectively ad copy or business communication.
Yes. And then the hyper recursion that the data sets now have LLM generated text in the data sets. So like,
yes, which people have actually proven does cause model collapse, actually.
So
like, someone's going to have to put more and more labor into actually filtering the LLM generated text out of the training corpuses for future LLMs.
Now, one of the things that you pointed out cognitively that I think we should think about is learning and thinking are heavily caloric processes. Like they take up a ton of resources. We don't think about them because no, you can't think your way into losing weight. But that's because thinking has like a steady state cost that's really high. Right? Whereas other physical activities don't. They have a variable energy input cost depending on what you're doing, and thus they're more manipulative for stuff like weight loss. But if you actually looked at where most of your calories went in your body, your brain eats up a ton.
20% is the number.
Yeah, quite a bit considering it's not 20% of your body. I have been thinking about this a lot because my issue with LM, particularly when people start talking about mystical super gods like AGI, which, by the way, not to speculate, but I do wonder if allegedly this does not come from just doing too many amphetamines. But I see your head just hurts when I mention AGI.
Okay, so I mean, here's the thing. It's sort of like, I know a lot of people who are very into this kind of thing and have done for, you know, more than a decade now. Since, you know, my like initial training was in computing. So around the time these ideas started to become cool, they were cool with, you know, computer nerds who all knew each other. And the thing is, you know, of course, you can draw very dramatic conclusions from thought experiments that have these seemingly intuitive premises. I'm trying to look up, you know, who was
Nick Bostrom? Nick Bostrom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
there's so much brain damage that Nick Bostrom has wrought. But go ahead.
Oh, well, what I was going to say is, you know, the problem is trying to actually prove that those assumptions hold regarding any natural or engineered system, right? Because their assumptions are assumptions. Nick Bostrom is not a neuroscientist. Neuroscience and cognitive psychology are by no means finished fields. You know, this is not Newtonian mechanics where we can retrospectively look back and say, yeah, we've got the correct theory and it works on pretty much every experiment we give it a shot at. You know, this is set and done. This is settled science. No, it's not settled science. And so how the hell do you know that those assumptions hold? Could you try to build a system deliberately such that the assumptions would hold? Yeah, you totally could, but it's going to take decades of your life and, you know, potentially unbounded amounts of money. And by the way, no tech VC is going to fund you for basically saying, you know, give me the equivalent of an entire university department to myself for 30 years, which is where the overblown claims come from, right? You know, I'm not going to reveal who all my friends are, but I have a friend who started a company and was told to put the word super intelligence in the pitch to raise money. So I am not, you know, I'm not trying to say AGI is impossible. I don't think it is, because scientifically we could understand the brain. I do think that it is, if it ever arrives, you know, because there could be economic barriers to it, there could be infrastructural or regulatory barriers to it. You know, there could be all kinds of reasons why producing sci-fi type AGI is just not practical, even if it's possible in theory or in physical principle. So if it ever arrives, it's going to take a lot more collective effort than anyone is claiming it will right now. There will be no one neat breakthrough that gets you there.
I think my thought about it is, if we assume the caloric inputs of the human brain and then we like map a brain that can do all of it at once, the power ratios for me, I was reading More of Everything All the Time, I think is the name of the book. It's by an astrophysicist critiquing this industry. But like, we're talking about the power of a sun for some of these transactions. And yeah, I think maybe you could theoretically come up with, maybe there's a way to have the power of a sun on Earth without depleting every single resource that we have very quickly. But we don't have that. And so, you know, I find, you know, even in my more utopian, like, let's think about what this would be like under socialism things, I'm just like, I still don't think we would easily do that. The energy costs would be, they seem to me like they'd be enormous. And the energy costs to AI are quite large. And they don't seem to be making a headway in making them more efficient. I mean, DeepSeek did some, but I don't see a whole lot of evidence that we are getting more energy efficient on these things. And I also don't see there's many incentives for them, since the profit model is actually almost solely based on NVIDIA chips being put into server farms, not on any other out-end product. So, you know,
I mean, the funny thing is, speaking as a socialist, one of the reasons the industry acts this way is because, you know, basically they're trying to spend on constant capital rather than variable capital, meaning labor.
Right.
You know, not that labor in this field is cheap. It actually, you know, due to sheer volume of demand, it is not cheap. You can make a good living as a, you know, generative AI research engineer thingy. But if you thought about, well, how much would you actually need to just look at LLMs and say, well, this would never be scalable enough to run at AGI scale without consuming a sun's worth of power. Therefore, we will invest in finding a whole new paradigm that will be, you know, much, much, much cheaper and closer in power efficiency to the human brain. And by the way, this is the kind of pitch that, you know, people put in their grant proposals and in their papers on the academic science end. You know, people will say, the brain takes about like 2 watts of power to run. Your data center takes gigawatts of power to run. Actually, I don't think it's 2 watts. That's an embarrassment. I should unsay that. Point being, it is on I believe, like 2 digits number of watts, less than 100. Data center takes gigawatts. Therefore, let's try and understand the brain so we could build better engineered systems. And broadly, the preference by investors is, no, let's just build more of the same thing we already know how to build, rather than take the risk of basically paying people to produce research papers that have, no guaranteed success.
Right. Although both early classical economists and Marxists would tell you that the preference for fixed capital versus variable capital is a disastrous preference in the long run, because eventually market will drive everything down to cost and you have no labor market to fluctuate around. Which will be very bad for you.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I always try and tell people, you don't have to be like a true believer, quote unquote, Marxist to just observe that everyone in business and industry are basically following trends that they know have to be altered. They're following straight lines, trajectories that they know are going to have to be altered at some point, and they're effectively waiting until the people in charge get together in a room over whiskey and cigars and decide that it's finally time to allow something different to happen, and decide to, deploy their authority in suitable ways. So like everyone knows they're coasting from, sort of fad to fad or crash to crash.
Yeah. I mean, and for people who don't understand this, I think this is also why we've seen this shift, not just in this area, but in general towards rents. It's been the weirdest thing for me is arguing with like non-Marxist socialists and heterodox economists that the profit rates have been increasing since 28. And I'm like, no, revenues have been increasing, but profits have not. If you look at per item, like if you looked at the item in aggregate and looked at how much money you make off selling one item of thing, those profits are down. And it shows up in GDP. No, GDP doesn't go negative very often, but we would be ecstatic to hit the relatively low GDP growth of China. I say relatively low compared to its historical norms, which between the 70s and the mid-aught teens was 10-20%. Now it's 5%, and it's a mature economy. It makes sense that it's that. But I mean, my point is on this, it's just like this all affects this stuff. That you can't separate this technology from the economic basis of which it is emerging. And the other thing that we have to be honest about, and one of the things that actually does make me think about why this set of billionaires seems so clueless, both socially and even in other things compared to other sets of billionaires, is they did. I mean, not to sound like a classical economist, but there's a giant free rider problem on all these tech industries because they free rode off the government and then venture capital until they were big enough to have monopsony power. They did not actually get this from standard production, and the one that came closest is still not, as like AWS services and Amazon's backend, and even that is limited on what it would have done with government investment.
And the thing about Jeff Bezos and Amazon is that he's always made, first of all, Jeff Bezos himself has always retained enough of a share in his firm, despite it being publicly held, that he can effectively cast a one-man controlling vote.
Right.
He always makes sure of that. And two, he has always chosen to reinvest in capturing market share over actually distributing out the profits as dividends to shareholders. Like Amazon, in a lot of years, does not make a nominal profit because they are reinvesting so much. And this is a deliberate choice. Obviously, Amazon.freaking.com is not a charity case that is, taking on, they're not a zombie firm in what I think would be the Japanese sense or the 2008 sense. No, he's just prioritizing, being the winner in the markets he competes in over actually returning a profit to shareholders, at least temporarily.
Well, this is a sense in which I think why people might find the. I recently had Alex Hochili on to talk about the Neofeudal thesis, and I've had Nico on in a show that will come out before this one will, but has not come out yet. Talking about profit rates, but one thing that is like feudal development isn't just the rents. It's that there's so much extraction that there's a low investment in the future. Now, the difference between us and the feudal period is there wasn't a way to really invest.
Yeah.
In the period. But there is for us. And by investment, you're like, oh, but there's all this stuff in the stock market. I'm like, no, a lot of that is wealth transfers, people. By invest, I mean investing in something that's going to produce a physical, tangible commodity or enable physical, tangible commodities to be produced downscale. I mean, you could argue with futures, it's not a direct, but it's an indirect, blah, 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 blah. But there's something going on there. That's not what we see right now. We're seeing basically stock capture, and yet the profitability is in the physical, tangible commodities, the data centers, and it's overvalued AI firms to the fact that they'll even admit that it's overvalued now. Like you got Bezos and Zuckerberg talking about a bubble, and it's weird because you have people like Derek Thompson over there at Abundance who should know better, trying to argue that no, they're wrong about their own businesses. And I'm like the people doing this are telling you what's happening at this point. Like, what is wrong with you? Which I bring people go, okay, well, what does this have to do with the soul of the new type? Well, under what conditions would the kinds of things we're assuming about structural cognition emerge if this is the economic context for it? Like, I just don't know what kind of investment would lead to a more functional AI. If part of why it seems profitable is revenue capture by dysfunction. And the other thing we have to admit is so far there is no evidence of increased enough productivity to justify the layoffs that have been tied to AI. If they're actually really tied to AI, which I'm actually somewhat skeptical of myself, right? Like I'm not sure that all these layoffs are actually about that, but that is what we're being told that they are about. And you're like, well, but the job market's still strong. And I've also been like, okay, how many people are retiring? How many people are over 67? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, the largest generation in the history of the United States, actually in the history of the world, is dying now. That's going to make a lot of assumptions about how job growth does and does not go, and where unemployment's going to show up a lot harder to track, because you just have a lot of people who are leaving the labor force for other reasons and not necessarily being replaced.
I mean, the thing about today's market conditions in terms of inflation, unemployment, like basic goods, is that, rather than having no idea what might be causing any given phenomenon, we have 5 to 7 ideas what might be causing any given phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the trouble is working out what combination of all the known factors is actually doing something.
That's a very valid point. So I guess to go back to some of the things that we were talking about, to tie this back into the initial discussion, a lot of the discussion about cognition emerging from Nico is about issues around what we might call information through classical semiotics. And by classical semiotics, I'm not so much mean Cicere and that sort of thing, or Charles Sanders Peirce. I mean Umberto Eco and maybe Roland Barthes. what do you make of those semiotic assumptions? I mean, I do think semiotics is kind of it was a sexy field in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and it's kind of not so much anymore. But what do you make about some of those assumptions and how it might affect the assumptions he's making about AI?
So I think that at least as regards LLMs, Nico is mostly, pretty spot on, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of division between LLMs and humans that I would think is the interesting distinction to make.
Okay.
Because the thing about LLMs is that because they have, a training phase, and then you just run them. Since they're effectively grinding out little bits of dead cognitive labor over and over and over again, and since they aren't properly thinking, they could, so to speak, be the first things to produce speech, while to produce speech in, let's call it, a fixed frozen semiotic field.
Mm-hmm.
Like for an LLM, the relationship between a word and what that word actually means, which of course for an LLM is, like a point in a high dimensional vector space, math. But the point being, for an LLM, that's actually fixed. For human beings, it never has been.
Mm.
And that's sort of, let's call that the rational kernel of postmodernism or post-structuralism that does have to be rescued at some point. And, by knowing about like information theory, statistics, and a bunch of these other fields that, go into making modern AI work, like we get a more formal scientific language to talk about, the relationship between the sign and the signified that sort of goes beyond the false dichotomy of it's either fixed platonistically or it's completely mutable and, always being reinvented ex nihilo. Like that's a false dichotomy. It's sort of a more statistical relationship of I say a word, what do, and then there's your background of what most people you've known have meant by that word. There's also your knowledge of me as an individual. What do I usually mean by that word? And then maybe there's even your own prescriptivist tendencies. But then there's also the question of like, where are you and I each trying actively to move a conversation by using a word? So all of these are sort of influences on, the statistics of words in living conversations by living people, whereas it's all frozen in LLMs.
That seems to be a pretty significant difference, and not just in the way that signs work, but in the way that like social recursion works. And this is one of the things that actually worries me about kids who offload thinking to LLMs. I've been told to tell students it's like, oh, you now have you can now have the social effects without being social. Basically, is what I'm told to sell this to them. Like you can get feedback on your writing without being in a writing group that causes you massive amounts of anxiety. I'm not going to get into the anxiety argument.
From who?
Right. I mean, you're getting statistical feedback from a variety of tokens, most of which is ad copy. Like, I actually monitor. Like, I have monitor writing feedback from these things. Teachers like it because it does reduce their time. But when I actually read what it suggests, I'm like, this is wildly inconsistent and sometimes self-contradictory evidence. Writing feedback that you have no social context for why it's giving it. This is the point. Like this approximates the social, but since its inputs are static, effectively, it doesn't actually have the dynamic impacts of social intelligence, which I actually do worry will have an effect on human intelligence. Not that we lose it, but like we are training people to misunderstand how they think and what they can do these things for, and thus having them underdevelop their own cognitive capacities. And I know I sound like a doomer when I talk about young people, but I have reasons for thinking that. What do you make of that?
I would say that eventually we're probably going to start as a society trying to pull ourselves out of the hole
Mm-hmm.
and developing a more real understanding. And if I can say something to hopefully preempt a little bit of the train crash and help people understand what's going on before they experience it live, I would say that in both a positive and in a negative sense, LLMs are ideology machines.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean ideology as in like lies, but as in they are almost literal embodiments of the sort of textual consensus reality that you might have once, read about in, say, your local hometown newspaper or seen on, the 3 national television channels, right? Like this sort of 20th century consensus reality. And I think that might actually be one of the hidden political angles to, why investment in LLMs is sort of like the opportunity to produce a consensus reality and then be able to fine-tune it to, your liking as a corporate or individual social actor.
Yeah. And it being more integrated in your life than television was, and thus more total. Like that.
Yeah.
I will say that the area where I'm convinced where LLMs are both effective and damaging is large data sets and surveillance. I actually do really think that. I mean, like, and if I think about what the hippocampus does, that makes sense to me. To go back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right. Like, why would you want to feed, every photo you ever take of yourself into a giant hippocampus that's going to memorize them and make all the symbolic and semiotic connections between them? Like, that's not Big Brother is watching anymore. That's you are performing for Big Brother, whether or not Big Brother is even there. Like, you're now designing your life as this series of, selfieable moments.
And if you think about it from this point of view, in a real sense, to me, it does make sense that the social media people got in on this. Because as I commented, I think it was maybe 2013 or 2014, I'm like, man, the liberals I know not care about privacy anymore, and also are encouraging people just to give it all up for monetary reasons in a way that would, like, I mean, what would the Stasi do if they had like the TikTok and Facebook algorithms? And I pointed this out to people, and they're like, "Oh, I don't know what you're concerned about." And now they're freaked out because, like, oh, well, the government's involved in this, and they're using this. I'm like, this was always possible. I mean, this total information awareness network stuff going all the way back to the Bush days, which they've done but had no means of correlating or doing anything with.
And that was back before every household had broadband internet.
Right.
Like, that was when broadband internet was a luxury for upper middle class people in Western countries.
Right. And when I tell people what your broadband internet stream can tell them about you, like, they know if they want to, they can figure out what room in the house you're in off that. Like, and people think, oh, you're being paranoid. I'm like, no, I'm not. I know how it works. Like, so much art makes movies funny. I watched One Better After Another a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh, they have to pretend there's a bunch of cars from like 1992 laying around so that they can do any of the stuff they need to do to make this movie work. Because good luck on hot wiring and or not being surveilled in a modern car. So
I mean, funny thing, isn't it? Hyundai and Kia, I'm told, you shouldn't buy nowadays because it's so easy to crack into their ignitions. They have digital fobs that you carry with you. And then, I think the RFID tag or the Bluetooth pairs up with the car and allows you to start the car, allows you as the legitimate owner, quote, legitimate owner. As in, it's not, a physical key with lock and tumbler.
Oh, those are rare now. My Subaru doesn't have one anymore either. Like, but some of them have really weak.
I own the model of car that I own because when I went to the dealer to get a car for the first time, I said, "Don't give me any of those digital fobs. I want a physical key." And that narrowed it down to like 2 models in the entire dealership.
Yeah, like an Elantra has one. And I do think people should be slightly alarmed about all this. I mean, I really do. Like,
I mean, much more likely, I will say, much more likely than a like super totalitarian ultra surveillance state that would have that would make mid 20th century regimes giddy is something more like what we're getting with these Hyundais and Kias, where effectively if someone cares to put in enough effort, they can break the system and effectively violate the social relations that are supposed to be the legitimate function of these systems. As in, they can steal your car, but they can also break the system, spy on you. So you're going to get like a lot of criminal stalking charges that make use of new digital means. And then, yes, sometimes when you have like, a stupid ass small town sheriff who doesn't care what's legal or what's not, then he might just, decide to watch where you're fucking going all the time via your cell phone or something like that. Like, there's a lot of things about these where they're supposed to be very locked down and effectively only available to powerful governments, and they're just not actually locked down that well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing I think we're learning is powerful government systems aren't as locked down as we thought either. I mean,
right, exactly.
Like I know that like most governments have their own internal network systems, but their public facing ones are so dependent on non-governmental systems like AWS that when AWS goes down, a whole lot of government functions and educational functions go down. Canvas went down, Zoom went down. Like if I had been in, I was off that week, but if I had been in person, I couldn't have done my job. Like, even though I have internal systems for FERPA reasons, so much of this is still interfacing with non-public systems that if those non-public systems go down or they're compromised or whatever, I can't do my job, or I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about this. I'm like, what does FERPA mean in the age of AI? Because we have been trying to figure out what to do about that. Because on one hand, they want us to use AI more. On the other hand, in my state, this is not all states. There are some states that are basically scraping kids' data like crazy, which I consider a violation of federal law. We actually do have lists of programs we can't use, including ChatGPT, because it scrapes data so thoroughly.
That's almost definitely illegal if you could just get a judge to actually... Basically, if you could get standing for a suit and then get a judge to understand what the fuck is going on, that's almost definitely illegal.
Right. And I was even hearing, I went to ISTE a year ago. For those of you who know what ISTE is, it's the educational, the Institute for Educational Technology, Institute for the Study of Technology and Education, I think. But anyway, it's basically a giant ad for these corporations, particularly with AI. Just going to put that out there. But there was a lot of discussion about, like, with these data concerns, that schools would need to develop their own AIs and their own internal AI systems. And then we were like, with what money and with what power? Like, if you think it's expensive to have teachers, like, if we have to do our internal AI systems, like, we have to do something that, I don't know, that the most valued revenue producing company in the world right now can't make profitable because it's so expensive. Like, so
here's where I would like to actually ask you a sociological question, which is, where the hell are the actual budget constraints right now? Because, and I don't mean that in any fine-grained sense, I mean really, if these things cannot be made profitable, then why don't they stop?
It seems like, for lack of other viable, profitable investments, that everyone is taking a venture that this bubble will eventually be profitable, even if it's not as profitable as it is right now, sometime in the future. But there's lots of evidence that is breaking, that companies are beginning to doubt they're going to get that payoff. The problem is why I'm not willing to predict that the bubble's going to burst, like, we're talking in late October of 2025, but like in the next 1 or 2 months, is we've actually seen a period where this almost happened a year and a half ago and it didn't.
Oh, you mean the Silicon Valley Bank thing in 2023?
Yes. Yeah, I do. And there's also been several reports about the profitability not being there that have come out from major business institutions in MIT, and it spooked investors, but they recovered. Or even the DeepSeek thing, which spooked investors, but they recovered. And I am wondering if people are so afraid of these revenues driving up and having to figure out profitability again that they're going to try to keep this floating for as long as possible. Which also means that the repercussions of when those budget constraints do come are going to be massive. And let's not also forget.
Sorry to roll my eyes, but to say something very stereotypical, I am a millennial, and I just heard that there's going to be a once-in-a-lifetime economic crash for the third time in my life, for the third time in my adult life, and I'm only 36.
Right. I'm a Zennial. I am the youngest of the Gen Xers, and this is like my fourth. So. I mean, but here's the thing.
It's that point where you find yourself reading, American Affairs, going, "Gosh, it would be nice if the bourgeoisie would exercise some bourgeois discipline over its own goddamn behavior."
Yeah,
so to subject the rest of us to the discipline of bourgeois social relations all the time.
I mean, well, I bet we in Marxism we often talk about the decay of proletarian relations and the decay of the proletariat. I talk about it too, but I've actually been really thinking about, why the hell is our bourgeoisie this bad? I mean, it's bad enough that a lot of people could have believed until Trump that actually the bourgeoisie wasn't running anything, that it was just a bunch of PMC people running the intermediary. Trump has removed that ability to argue that, but it's just guys, there's our masters are bad at doing the thing that they're supposed to do.
Their whole job is to make the fucking numbers add up,
and they don't.
Go read Seth Ackerman in Jacobin, 2012, and his references to Kornai, the Hungarian economist. The hard budget constraint and the discipline of running an operating surplus, that's the entire fucking point of capitalism. That is its only and chief defining virtue, is that every enterprise that can't make the number add up to something more than zero goes out of business.
The creative destructive part, it's why it has been productive historically, but right now we don't have any evidence that it's able to do that. I mean, it does lead to, for a Marxist at least, is this weird counter state of affairs is, can you have capitalism that's not profitable, and thus all the benefits that we put into capitalism not actually happen and it just decay? Not necessarily into feudalism, but the reason why, to go into some historiography for a second, the reason why I say is feudalism a mode of production, it's about 4 different modes of production, some of which overlapped. What you really see is what Chris Wickham calls the feudal revolution, which is actually a decayed order that tries to reestablish itself in several different ways. And in that sense, I'm like, we're not there yet, but I actually could see this going that way. The other thing that we have to deal with is the state is going to be, despite all the neoliberal rhetoric we see out of the Trump administration, the state is more and more and more and more directly involved in capital production. Now, it actually was in neoliberalism too, but go ahead.
Of course it was, but everyone who's remotely observant has been calling for a few years now, oh yeah, it's oscillating back towards state capitalism.
Right. The war economies of the early 20th century, which was our answer to the last time there was a once in a lifetime financial crisis every so many years. Because I do like to point out that, like, in the long array of history, the middle 20th century is a weird development. There's not a whole lot of time periods like it. Like, and I think, go ahead.
Like, even from the normiest point of view, you know, it had the coinciding of, let's see, military Keynesianism and the war economies in the West, the height of the social democratic movements in the West, and a serious challenger in the form of the Eastern Bloc, which had not yet decayed.
Right.
So, like, that was back when you would go, you know, read the Wall Street Journal and they'd say, we're terrified of communism because their GDP growth rate is 12 and ours is 4. Numbers pulled out of my ass, of course, but like,
but not far from the truth. I remember even as late as the 1970s, people looking at the South Korea, the Republic of Korea's economic numbers versus the DPRK's economic numbers, and the DPRK was kicking its ass. Like, now that obviously the DPRK's economy has recovered somewhat in the last 10 years, although people who don't follow it, I do, but a lot of people don't follow it, don't know how much it's liberalized. It just can't liberalize with the West because of sanctions. It's liberalized with Russia and China. But, and by liberalization, I only mean economic liberalization. I do not mean any other kind of liberalization. I just mean
like, go away, Fukuyama.
Yeah,
My mouth keeps trying to say Futurama. I've been on too many today.
Well, Fukuyama is interesting to me because I think I've been listening to BungaCast a lot more lately, and I think they're right that we're at the end of history, but just barely. Like, because we still don't have real competing ideologies. I always talk when I talk about, like, you know, China, they may internally be socialist in their political orientations. They, in the 1982 Constitution, declare themselves to have achieved socialism. However, no Chinese premier has said that in, like, I don't know, the last 3. And they keep on talking about, you know, socialist reforms necessary to fully achieve full socialism, and that date keeps getting pushed back. But my point has always been, but even if you think they're socialists, they're totally integrated into the capitalist economy in a way that makes us co-relational, even with BRICS and stuff, even if the IMF falls down. Like,
I mean, so was the Eastern Bloc in the first place.
That's also true.
You know, this is maybe my own hot take, not yours, but, you know, it's always jumped out to me that sort of the decay and decline of the Soviet Union began roughly around the same time that the West had its own profitability crisis.
I think it's also interesting that that's also when the Soviet Union was taking out IMF loans, which people don't ever even know.
You know, I mean, and to be fair, I'm not sure the Soviet Union would even have, like, claimed at the time that they were some entirely separate planet from, you know, maybe they would have claimed it from the West. They certainly wouldn't have claimed it about the non-aligned states that they traded with.
Correct. I'm not sure they would have even claimed it from the West. They probably would have just thought they were getting leverage to eventually pull the rest into communism. Depending on who you were talking to,
like they were, you know, for at least up until the very end, they wanted to win the Cold War.
Right. I mean, this is the paradox of the paradox of socialism in one country is, like, they never really acted like they believed it either. Like, sure that they were, like, trying not to freak out the Allied powers and encourage revolution everywhere, but they never acted like they thought they could develop their economy totally autarkically. They never did. I mean, you start seeing that ending even when Stalin's alive. So it's
which, you know, to bring things back to the end of history, like, brings us to sort of paradox of neo-Stalinism, where, like, the people looking back nostalgically at, you know, Mao's China or Stalin's Soviet Union are effectively like more Stalinist than the actual Stalinists ever were.
Oh yeah.
Like people are making things up that these things never claimed in life.
For example, that like there was no revolutionary bourgeois in the settler colonies, which I'm like, okay, that seems like a small historiographic.
In the United States and Canada?
Right, including the United States and Canada. MLs will claim this today, and I'm like, you realize that Stalin would have literally had you shot for saying that? Like,
oh yes, the United States, it really just has no forward momentum. Like, it has no driving force from its own capitalist class's profit motive. Like,
right. No, it was all just settler colonialism. A category which did not exist in Soviet historiography and came out of dissident Maoist in the 70s in the Americas, actually predominantly in the United States. Like it's, you know, and was picked up by a lot of this stuff. And I'm not even saying that there's no truth to settler colonialism as a historiographic understanding of what happened in the Americas.
No, I mean, like, look, let's be frank, we're living in a country that still has the Homestead Act on the books.
Right.
Like, there's no point pretending that's not true.
Right. But the idea that it somehow like undoes any form of momentum of history, I say this as I'm a critic of like Marxists who believe in linear progress, so I want to be very clear about that. But like, I find that just to be like kind of nutty to me, particularly because they still keep France in, and I'm like, how are you going to argue that the French Revolution, they also did settler colonialism, they also had slavery, their ancien regime actually survived for longer? Like,
so to be a little more positive rather than just complaining, like, I think the problem with some of these categories that have arisen on the American left, and I'm especially thinking of like what tends to be sort of this blurring boundary between Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, and what we could call social justice radical liberals, often found like in academia and nonprofits. Like, the problem with these things is that they don't help us to see how our own time is different from other times. You know, they have what I've heard called a very paternalist view of history, where there was like one moment that happened or one event that happened well into the past, and that set the course of pretty much, you know, all of society up to today. And therefore we have no, you know, our responsibility is to understand that founding moment. Say for the New York Times, it was 1619 when the first slave ship landed.
Although
rather
if you
than
it to its logical
how
conclusion,
2025 is different from 1975.
Right. The 1619 project, or if we're completely honest, it should probably be the 1492 project. Like,
I mean, I'd love to see the Anglophone left start to be, shall I say, fairly critical to some of these people in the way that the left in certain other countries has. Like, you know, I'm thinking of, you know, the translated review of Huria Butelja's book, where, you know, the translator basically notes that, like, the Francophone left thought this book was trash and excoriated it. And then the Anglophone left, via Verso Books, was just like, oh, we love this. And like that just seems like a very historically contingent and arbitrary difference of opinion to me. Maybe the Anglos could listen to the Francos a little bit more. But anyway, point being, this author...
We only like our Francophone left from the post-Marxist part of the 70s, even when we're Marxists. We don't like our actual existing Francophone left that exists now.
Well, okay, I guess point being for the listener, like, this author has this book. She says, they say 1789, will answer 1492.
Mm-hmm.
Which I will just point out is very silly because she's Tunisian. Like, Columbus didn't actually sail to your country. Your country was part of a large, well-known empire that both traded and fought with the Europeans the entire time for hundreds of years.
In fact,
You are not in the new world.
But to bring on the eternal presentism, I have really seen this. I've had people on my show who would argue. I mean, you see this in certain MMT circles too. That there is no distinction, like, oh, you should think of guilds in the medieval sense as like advocacy groups today. And I'm like, but advocacy groups don't keep trade secrets. What?
They don't keep trade secrets, and they also don't have the ability to enforce via independent violence or via the state any kind of licensure.
Right. I mean, it's just
like there is such a thing as, licensure issues in the modern day. There was the license Raj in India, and then there's like your capital N neoliberals complaining about hairdressing licensure in like the present day United States. But this seems to me a very different thing from medieval guilds.
Right. I mean, and I've seen this claimed a lot, and I've also talked about like I have to go to other modes of discussion now because historiography is afraid of any historiography theory that would have any explanatory power at all. And I mean that. I know that sounds like me complaining, but to tie it back to the original point of this show, when we talk about Nico here, which we haven't talked about a lot in a way, to me, Nico's hopes about AI are limited by the fact that I think he treats the technology as not having certain trends that you would have to undo in development, not just expropriate, but actually change if you were going to use it for socialist means. Like it's not just a matter of I used to argue a little bit with Lee Phillips about this. It's not just a matter of you taking over the Walmart supply line. You have to kind of change what the Walmart supply line is for and what it's doing in a way that might require you to do different engineering.
So I'm going to send you the link to this, but as part of a journal club that I run with like a couple of colleagues, I gave this short like technical talk, and this is technical, so it's for AI and neuroscience people, but I titled it Abolish the Value Function. And that, partly this was an actual criticism of, the mathematical construct in the field of reinforcement learning called the value function, where I was saying these systems are inflexible because, they have a non-interpretable reward function, which then gets aggregated across time into this thing called the value function, requiring them to be very inefficient and require these massive amounts of training data and GPU time, blah, 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 blah. But also, I'm sure if you sit through the lecture, what'll probably jump out to you is that, basically I'm referencing, Muravsky. It's all a hidden reference to like Muravsky's More Heat Than Light. Where he was talking about how, value theory has often been about trying to find a conserved quantity associated with a variational principle that then drives the gradient flow of political economy. It is 19th century physics math that was ripped off and relabeled so that classical economists could then say, here's how an economy works, here's how we show that it reaches equilibrium. And what Muravsky goes through and shows in that book is that pretty systematically, not only are these like borrowed metaphors and borrowed math, but in order for that math to hold, as I mentioned, you would need a conservation law, which would mean a law of conservation of value, saying that value can be neither created nor destroyed in the economy. Which, from both a non-Marxist socialist and a Marxist sense and an MMT sense, and even a bourgeois neoliberal marginalist sense, is complete nonsense. Creating value is the whole point of the capitalist economy.
Right. No, I mean, this was a problem with trying to map technocratic assumptions onto capitalism in the early 20th century. For those of you who don't know, the technocrats actually tried to come up with a theory of value based on energy, not even labor, energy expenditure. And the value would not
that I've heard people try to do that again.
Right. And I'm like, I would love for that to work. I have no idea even more than labor, how you would measure that. And they didn't figure it out either. But the other thing is they tried to say that what they were doing was not like socialism because you could do a capitalist economy on it. And I'm like, how? How in the world could you do a capitalist economy with a steady state theory of value based off of energy expenditure? Like,
yeah. So to get back to Lee Phillips, actually, because, I know him, I like him, I would consider him a, quite friendly acquaintance and, a good political colleague. I greatly enjoyed his book, People's Republic of Walmart. But yes, I was making, little margin notes in my Kindle saying, all of these assumptions about planning assume that you have a value function that you're going to optimize. And for a capitalist firm, that value function is their operating surplus. And now the problem is that the classical socialists, like, up through maybe Lenin and then the USSR, like their vision of socialism was to basically say you take the entire economy under vertical and horizontal integration as, the absolutely massive org chart of a single firm.
Mm-hmm.
And if
teleological development of everything. That was the approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, besides, the philosophical assumptions of teleology, if you had, before your firm encompassed the whole economy, simply when there ceased to be, meaningful budget constraints and market competition, the operating surplus would no longer reflect the thing that it's supposed to reflect within capitalism.
Right.
So you have to, if you wanted to take over the economy and run it this way as a socialist, you would have to come in and replace the value function that goes into these planning and optimization algorithms. You would have to wholesale replace it with something new that could then indicate some kind of, sociological metric or econometric construct, that you had invented and could assure yourself reflects something meaningful even when the conditions of capitalism no longer hold.
Right. Interestingly, this is consistent with, I remember getting people not putting together Lee's position on growth, on bright green growth, eco-socialism versus degrowth. Now, I have said that I think the whole debate's wrong. That I actually agree with you. You need a lot of investment, but that if you're running a socialist economy, I don't know what surplus growth means in the same way. I just don't, and nor are you necessarily investing for having to reinvest. You actually want the investment to be we have planned obsolescence everywhere. Earlier economies really didn't do that, and because they didn't need to. And we all, by earlier economies, I mean early capitalist and pre-capitalist economies. I kind of my pushback on Lee was the same thing. If we're not doing, if there's no GDP growth because we don't give a shit about gross domestic product in that way, what are we even talking about? Why would you be pro-growth versus the anti-growth? We're talking about how you allocate resources, and the resource allocation would have a different function than surplus accumulation. Mm-hmm. Even if you were doing some surplus accumulation to take care of people can't work, to develop technology, etc., that's not your primary modus operandi anymore. And it just seemed
and then you have to actually come up with social relations that make all of the incentives and the discipline mechanisms actually work out. I've, due to my professional history, I have some engagement with, planning algorithms and optimization constructs and things where you aren't using what I would call, a value function. Mm-hmm. You have something that's mathematically similar, but the point is it has measurable, interpretable units that you could think about as being much more like output quotas. Mm-hmm. So someone gives you an output quota and you try to turn your crank and come up with a plan that satisfies the quotas, while leaving margin for error and margin for surprising things to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the math works out under the assumption of either A, you're running this on a computer, so it's not human, it doesn't have a will of its own, Or B, you're working in the context of a vertically integrated firm or even command economy where you can tell people to do things and know that they will carry out your orders. So like it's a very, it runs into the limitation, like this kind of stuff, that it is a bit Gosplan-esque.
Right.
There is an assumption that you can give orders and they will be followed, and therefore all you need to do is give like socially beneficent orders somehow. But of course, in the real world, like that's not true. The Soviet Union was never a perfect, hive-minded command economy where everyone did what they were told.
Absolutely not. Particularly over time.
Right, like particularly over time, and like the need to apply repression in order to conform to that model is part of why people got cynical and disenchanted with the project, even when they were born and raised as like ardent communists.
Right.
So then there's the question of how do you arrange social relations so that people want to contribute to, a democratically decided upon plan.
Right.
Or, for democratic, substitute some word that means good if you happen to not like democracy.
Right. For me, there is some hope in some cybernetic inputs of making those inputs more participatory of the people who make them. But even then, I mean, like we talk about this in CyberSyn, as I pointed out before when I had a specialist on Allende's experiments in Chile. It actually wasn't CyberSyn that made that feasible. It was some of the cybernetic social dynamics being applied to the Cordones system, which CyberSyn would have made coordinatable, but was not actually the thing. So I've pushed people on their misunderstanding of what CyberSyn even was. I'm like, CyberSyn barely got off the ground. We don't actually know if it would have worked.
Okay, so I'm going to say something really counterintuitive, but I almost think in a certain way more leftists should go to grad school or something. As in, I wish people, because really, like a lot of this stuff actually does give me a sense of persistent optimism for what's possible, right? Because I don't think that these are insurmountable problems and will never get anywhere. They're the kinds of problems where you can put a team of people to work for like 5, 10, 15 years, and they will come up with something.
I think that they should go to grad school, but in the sciences, but not in engineering for reasons that I do not entirely understand. But engineers always end up being the most. This is just the psychological research I'm referring to. Like engineers tend to be dogmatists in the extreme of whatever ideology they pick up, and like
and like I will just
mathematicians
say like I'm path dependent. I got lucky that my PhD advisor was like. Well, I had multiple advisors, but one of them, Jan Willem, was like this very, open-minded and even-keeled person. And then Lisa Feldman Barrett, author of How Emotions Are Made, she's, managed to become scientist famous. But point being, she was someone who actually had her first experiment fail in grad school, famously so, because the theory behind it was just wrong. And she has spent most of her career disproving the theory that she entered grad school in order to prove correct. And so like everything about her advising style and how she teaches science and what she passes down to her students in a very path-dependent way is completely dependent upon this experience of like going to do confirmatory normal science in the Kuhnian sense and having it blow up in your face.
Right. She's actually one of the people who does the thing that Popperians say science is supposed to do, but actually study the sociology of science only happens rarely. It does happen, but
right. I mean, it mostly happens when like a very senior famous person dies,
yes,
or retires. Like it's another reason why lifting the age cap on holding tenured professorships in the 90s was possibly actually a bad idea.
Oh God, I didn't even think about that. But we will go on. I actually have like when I talk about redesign, what would Varn make a university? I'd be like, there's job protections for everyone, and there's no tenure. um, and decisions are made leading committees like tenure, but this hierarchy system that's quasi-medieval that tenure is based off, that you guys tell me is something like good job protection, y'all have not worked as academics, or you're lying about your experience of doing so, because that was a nightmare field. And not just in the humanities. Like,
this is another one of those things where we could do to listen to people from other countries, because the Anglo university system has this thing where we're all looking, especially in the United States, especially in the United States, softer in other Anglo countries. We're looking over our shoulders and going, oh my God, if I leave the academic track, I'll have to deal with at-will employment. Meanwhile, someone like France, Germany, Italy, like China, Japan, Singapore, pick any country developed enough to have universities that are taken seriously on the world stage, and they'll tell you, what? No, I have an employment contract.
Yeah.
It says I get seniority after, N years, and the degree of seniority rises over time and protects me from being arbitrarily fired for no reason.
As a foreign professor,
without ever making me into a miniature medieval lord.
Right. Exactly. When I worked
in some places, even auto workers on an assembly line can have that kind of job security.
In France, I mean, in the Nordic countries, and look, I'm a big proponent of, hey, America, don't try to do Nordic socialism, because they're not even really trying to do it anymore. But Nordic job protections and Nordic contract, oh, you lose some productivity. I'm like, oh yeah, we've been so great at productivity lately. And also, the Germans are still pretty damn productive last time I checked. I mean, not since they can't rely on Russian gas anymore, but it's not their workforce's problem why they're not. So it's I find this kind of fascinating to me. But yeah, when I worked in South Korea for 2 years as a lecturer, which is a non-tenured professor. But if I had stayed at that job for 5 years, it would be hard to fire me. You could do it, but I'd actually have to violate my professional ethics group. So I effectively had tenure, even though I could never get tenure as a lecturer. I could get promoted to reader and some other things, but research teacher. But even in that system where there was tenure, there wasn't the nightmare system I saw in the United States, where full professors are basically lords.
So my very even-keeled and open-minded advisor, Jan Willem, from the sound of his name, he's Dutch, right? And he basically explained that he had done academia in a number of different countries, and he said, in the United States, your PI is the head of your mafia, and your different mafias are facing off against one another, sort of competing in the pseudo market for government grants.
That sounds correct.
In the United Kingdom, where the system was more that the principal investigator was the king and dispensed favors according to personal views of favor and disfavor among lower level scientists, where lower level means these are actually people in their 40s with families and PhDs who've been working for 20 years. They've been in the workforce for 20 years and have effectively no independence, because you don't have independence until the king decides you're ready to become a fellow king.
Yeah,
it can vary a lot.
Yeah, I've actually I made this joke with Alex Chili. One of the ironies about right now is the one actual semi-feudal institution in American life is the one that's being destroyed.
Yep.
Not to depress you as a would you still consider yourself an academic?
Let's say for the moment, no.
Okay.
I'm not going to go into more detail.
You don't need to.
Like, I don't like to announce what job I'm in until it has officially started and I have, like, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. For me, when people are like, oh, you're an academic, I'm like, I used to be, but I'm not anymore. I don't have, I mean, unless you consider high school teachers academics, which no one does.
It's not part of your job to like review papers in journals, publish in journals, and attend conferences. You're not an academic. Like,
nope. I attend conferences for fun. like I and I've occasionally written papers for fun. Like I have gone to I've gotten into conferences in fields I don't have high degrees in, which I find kind of funny. But
I mean, that is the positive and open side of peer review, right? Which is that, like, if you can pass peer review in a field, then you can publish in that field, whether or not you have a formal qualification for it. The negative side of this is that, of course, no one can stop physicists from barging into other people's fields.
That's also true. I did sort of offend some Ivy League intellectual historians when they're asking me, well, what's it like writing an intellectual history versus literature? And I'm like, well, if you do literature well, there's no difference. If you do literature review well and not theory gobbledygook, there's no difference at all. Which I think actually made every side of that equation kind of mad. But I was just like, I go into archives, I look up stuff, I historically contextualize it. That's what I was trained to do.
Yeah, honestly, it's kind of weird. It's weird to me coming from STEM that this would piss people off, because from my point of view, the literature review is the part of the paper or the monograph that you write precisely in order to contextualize your novel contribution in the recent history of the field. And like, it's not meant to be an intellectual history. It's meant to provide context for the other part of the work.
Right. Whereas I find that, like, I won't go on the theoretical. When I talk about the theoretical term in the humanities, people are always surprised because I know so much theory. But I'm like, I think in literature it was a disaster because it didn't lead to better theory. It led to misapplying old theory to papers where the theoretical constraints were social, but now we're talking about literature and art. And then somehow that being taken as radical. Thank you, Verso, for publishing all that shit as if it was somehow political commentary. And I've always pointed out that one of the first things that you notice in a lot of these fields is, like, the lit people, as soon as they get tenure, what they never do? Publish on literature anymore. They start writing weird history books or communization theory or whatever. Not trying to convince you that there's something meaningful about post-structuralism when applied to Faulkner. But anyway,
I don't know what you did your degrees in, but I did not do mine in literature, so I am not going to comment on air. I have enough bad tweets without saying something with my real face and name.
That's totally fair. I actually did work. I worked in literature and in philosophy separately. It's two different undergrad degree paths. Because I thought I was going to be a lawyer, which is I've always found it weird.
Analytic, by the way.
Historical continental and analytic modern. So I did Hegel and backwards, and then what I did modernly was all analytic philosophy. So actually, I studied a lot of Derick Parfit, which I don't consider myself an analytic philosopher. In fact, one day I'm going to debate Ben Burgers on the usefulness of analytic philosophy after a certain time period. But I did train myself in, like, I read Roger Penrose, I read Derick Parfit, I read Brandom, that's what I was reading. And what I got interested in grad school, but at this point I was in an MFA, so who the fuck cares what I thought? Before I got into education, was actually trying to bridge the difference between continental and analytic philosophy. I wanted, like, I wanted a dialogue, and there was some hints that like with Ray Brazier, I'm never quite sure how I said that name, and stuff, and Brandom going on in Europe, that was possible to happen, but it didn't seem to actually take fruition after all. And I just moved on to other stuff like educational psychology and educational anthropology. So that, you know, I am in all those humanities that like butt right up to real science, but like don't go there. So I mean, technically education is social science, but I don't think I believe that. But anyway, we still teach learning styles.
As a bit of a side remark,
go ahead.
I mean, you have this within the sciences as well, where there's like engineering, physics and mathematics, the theoretical side of any discipline. So like biology, chemistry, physics, neuroscience, all of them are a lot more mathy and theory oriented. And then there's an experimental side that often is very close to being like no real skills except wet lab skills. And it turns out, you know, the reason for this is, of course, that like there's just that much wet lab stuff you have to learn in order to be minimally competent to run an experiment yourself.
Oh, yeah.
It's just hard to find people who are basically going to do twice the work in order to learn theory and experiment at the same time. But it does mean that you can have a lot of experimental work that like butts right up against the theory, but completely misuses the terminology and concepts. And then theorists who are out of touch with experiments. And it has occasionally had me think, like, you know, if I was God King of the Earth for a day, like one of the things I might try to do is like maybe immiserate myself a little bit by like trying to sort of raise the waterline of what we teach people in K through 12.
This is a whole different show. Maybe I'll have you come back so we can rant about this together. But like, I have been terrified at both. People talk about the lack of arts, but I'm like, but also STEM is taught so poorly. It's taught so decontextualized. And then math in high school is I am good at math. I did not know that until well into university, because I did not see the point of symbols and I do have dyslexia for numbers, just like I do for letters, but like I compensated for that. But I did not know that I was actually good at math until well into college, because I did not see the point of symbols pushing. I was like, well, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure I was actually bad at math until grad school. Like, I mean, to like really contextualize, there's this thing about learning programming early that just makes you bad at math. Because high school math is sort of taught in this very Platonistic way. They like have you learn trigonometry by getting out a unit circle and like pointing to, you know, the 45-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
And then what the trigonometric functions are for the 45-degree angle. And you ask, what about the 46-degree angle? And they say, get your calculator. And you ask, how did the calculator get that? And they can't tell you. And it's like, hey, so how did God decide the value of these functions if you can't give me a formula I could actually compute with? This is programmer brain. You know, then once you actually get up to like college level math, they will show you that, you know, you can use calculus to derive, you know, a convergent infinite series that allows you to approximately compute these numbers to, you know, however many terms you want. And like you'll learn eventually some topology and like what infinitesimals really are, what limits really are, like open intervals and open neighborhoods. And that's all very nice. And you'll finally learn and like enjoy enlightenment of like, so this is the difference between how I can push symbols around on a piece of paper and like geometry. And here's how they're actually connected. But until I got that, I would really say like I was not good at math. I was a computer geek.
Yeah, that's
And at no point did the pedagogy actually try to make the connection actively. Instead, it was just like, look, you need to have faith that, you know, the value of sine exists for 46 degrees. It exists for 47 degrees. because the calculator gives you, like the calculator, or what is it called, a slide rule, like, you know, you used to have log tables printed in the back of the textbook.
I used to use log tables, and I actually am. We had calculators when I was in school, but I actually was trained on a slide rule in elementary school. So, like,
yeah, like you just had to have faith that these things give you like close enough approximations. And if you ask close enough approximations for doing what, by the way, the answer is for doing engineering, like really for doing like mechanical engineering and civil engineering, because that is what the STEM curriculum is actually structured around, is, you know, producing enough like engineers for the 20th century.
which we don't do anymore. Even though we have the same STEM curriculum. So it's,
like, it is all actually structured by political economy underneath, and you just don't find out what you went through until you're well into adulthood.
right. Or if you're the average person, you never find out what you went through. Like, it's just like, what was that weird training even all about? Because I remember they would tell me like, oh, we're teaching you trigonometry so you know how logic works. And I was like, really? Because the only thing that I've ever studied in math that actually works like a logic function is a geometric proof. So, which is not
Those
actually
were also
true.
definitely the only proofs we had to do in high school.
Absolutely. I didn't know about other proofs until I was like in grad school studying psych stats. Like, it's just that's what I actually, also, that's when calculus actually made sense why I needed to know it. Because when I first learned, I'm like, this is just weird shit. I don't know why I need to know what a cosine does. And my students today in high school, like, I will explain to them like why you actually need to know the Pythagorean theorem and what you can actually do with it, the number of things you can actually do with it. And I'm the English teacher, and they're like, why are you teaching us this? And I'm like, well, because someone's got to teach you that this is actually useful, because it was a revelation to me when I learned that it was actually useful. But you know, I often tell people, like, the thing about math is like it doesn't actually work like the other sciences, but you can't do the other sciences without it. And logic, predicate logic looks like math even in the analytic sense, but it isn't. You know, it's related, you know, even neurologically, but it's not the exact same thing. Although, okay, to end on something about actually what we started this topic about, and this will be our last question. Why is it that LLMs can't do math that well? Like, because that does not actually make sense to me.
I'd have to look at the guts of an individual LLM to tell you that, because I'm sure someone has actually come up with the idea of, if you're given a prompt that looks like a math question, then just try to find the math question and turn it into symbols and feed it to a calculator prompt inside the computer and answer with that.
Right, and you can train them to do good math, but if you just throw math, and they'll do good code. Well, they'll do inefficient coding, but they will code. But the math functions, it's wild. Math teachers have told me what they get from the AI, and it's like, okay, like, that seems bizarre.
So if I had to, I don't have access to the training corpuses, so I'm really venturing a guess here based on my knowledge of how these things are trained. I would guess it's that most of the time, if you're just trying to predict like the next word in a sentence, then you're kind of going to do vibe math. Like, I know this sounds very fuzzy and vague, but if you remember, Stephen Colbert coined this word truthiness, then there's sort of, or I guess the better word might be sort of authoritativeness. And it's spitting out the thing that sort of sounds right, even though without being architected with like a coding prompt inside to actually run something that would calculate the answer, it doesn't have a proper ability to check. I guess think
That
of,
makes sense.
think of someone who doesn't actually know math, but they still want to answer the teacher's question because they're on the spot. And so they try to come up with something that's going to get by the teacher.
Yeah, that makes
The thing
sense.
is,
That does make sense.
yeah. Like if a real child does that, it's because they didn't do their homework and they're bullshitting. But, if an LLM does that, it's because they physically cannot, like they don't have the working memory, they can't visualize a piece of paper on which they could then, sketch like the arithmetic procedures they were taught.
Yeah.
Which is more or less what
sense.
actually, I don't know about you, but that is how I actually did mental math until eventually I had done it so many times that I started memorizing the answers to the simpler problems. Or like I would visualize, a number line. Like my fourth grade teacher, fourth, third, fifth, all of those, like taught us all of these kinds of tricks. But all of which involve sort of like our sensory motor imagination rather than just memorizing text.
That makes total sense. But actually, I remember doing that a lot myself. Was actually it like before I more internalized more math. Actually, going like I think I had like this vision of a number line a lot of the time. Like literally thought out the number line in my head. And I guess that's also part of the mind is structured like a language critique. Is like, well, I know there's people who don't make mental images supposedly, but I thought in pictures way more than I thought in letters or words exactly. I mean, there's still signs, and they still have semiotic content, but like it's not quite the same as a language. I think maybe even Nico would admit that like signs encompass language but are larger than that. But I would like to go maybe push him on like what that exactly means in a dynamic social system.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Eli, for coming on. We've been all over the place. I'm gonna have to retitle the title to this episode, but I'll figure it out. And this was just Nico response to Nicholas. Not Nico. Eli response to Nico via Real, and really that's only about a fourth of what we did today. But we'll have you back on. We might actually have I might actually have a symposium on education because I actually think so. Like, I know you would agree with me on this, but most people would be horrified. I think socialists should oppose progressive education.
Define progressive education.
Education that's understood by Deweyan assumptions and by also whatever Alfie Cohen is talking about this week, which are like which we need to educate for social justice. By that we mean we need to change standards, push against standardization. We need to focus on soft skills and social skills. We need to make school more about reparative justice, although by that we mean administrators not having to deal with students, really.
I would instinctively dislike the vibes of this sort of thing, but really, like a substantive critique would really be, look, we live in a world where kids are going to have to grow up and labor, and if we don't give them any skills to do that, aside from navigating social relations, then we're spitting out kids from the education system who are only qualified to basically be hot bourgeois bullshit artists.
Right.
And there aren't enough jobs available doing that.
Right. But these are from the same people who tell me that teaching code switching is oppressive, that students shouldn't have to do it.
Again, like just to be purely substantive and not vibes based, because I know myself, I will say too much. We have to admit that the education system is in a social context that is not ideal according to the educators, and that we are arming and equipping kids to deal with a world that they don't control and which is in many ways going to be hostile to their interests. Correct. Maybe that sounds a little too aggressive, but I would
be more aggressive than you. which is actually, but I think about this a lot. I mean,
dude, I've spent decades toning myself down and still have the instinct to think that I'm being harsh.
which is a funny thing, Eli. So have I. I go back and listen to, if you ever find anything from me from like 2012 or 2013, like I would, or even 2019. I'll be quite frank. Like when I would say stuff like checking your privilege has never changed anything in history at all ever. Like, which I now would nuance as it has rarely changed anything in history at all ever. But
now you're talking like a scientist. That's one of those lovely weasel words where you leave open the possibility that someone can come at you with an exceptional example you haven't heard of, but everyone knows that what you mean is never in my experience.
Exactly, which is like, which is still, I mean, fair. Like you come up with something not in my experience, that's fair. But yeah.
But if you've got a fairly broad experience, then it might be a fairly strong statement that someone should listen to.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much. Do you want to plug any of your work?
Just that abolish the value functionless lecture.
Okay. Send me that and I'll put it in the show notes. Thank you so much, Eli.
Sure. And I'll send my Google Scholar link.
Cool. All right. Take care.